Hi, everybody. Today I have a science/history lesson for you about the history of tomatoes. So, everybody take a second and picture a tomato. I can tell you that what I'm picturing is a red fruit that everybody gets confused and calls a vegetable. The one that I'm picturing is kind of like this shape, but in my brain, I can also know that there are some tomatoes that are more blobby shaped like that, like a Roma tomato. And then there's all those little tiny ones that grow in groups like cherry tomatoes. And there's even some tomatoes that are kind of like pear shaped like that. There's a lot going on in the world of tomatoes. And all of that goes way, way back to before the year zero. Scientists right now think that tomatoes were being grown in South America and Mexico back before the year zero, so back into the BCs. And they were eating those tomatoes for a long time before anyone from Europe found out about them. The tomatoes that were being eaten at that point weren't the big kind that we get now. They were these little tiny things that now we call currant tomatoes. They were about as big as the tip of your finger, so like about as big as your nail, maybe your thumbnail, since you have slightly smaller fingers than me. Not very big. They were like smaller even than a grape or a cherry tomato is now. And that's what those people were eating. And then if we fast forward in time for quite a while, and we get to the 1400s when all of those explorers from Europe went out and stuck flags and things and said they were theirs, remember that Columbus was one of the ones who did that. And so we talk about the Columbian Exchange in history as the time when Columbus made it to our general area and grabbed a bunch of things to take back with him, brought them back to Europe, and spread all these new interesting foods around to that entire continent. That's called the Columbian Exchange. He also brought a lot of like diseases and viruses over to this side of the world, but that's a story for another day. So in the Columbian Exchange, the 1500s, tomatoes were one of the things that made it over to Europe. But they did not get popular in Europe for a really long time. And the problem is that they made it to Spain, and then some tomatoes got taken to England. But when people saw them there, they got worried because tomatoes are in the same family as this plant called deadly nightshade. Now, if the name didn't clue you in, it's deadly. Like, don't eat its fruit, you will die. And so when they saw these tomatoes, they got worried. They thought, that can't possibly be food. Nope, not eating it. And when some people finally realized that it wasn't actually poisonous to eat a tomato, they still thought they were gross. They were like, oh, these things are weird. I'm not into it. And people even wrote things in journals and in cookbooks that have been passed down saying, oh, they have a rank and stinking savor, meaning they're grody and I don't want to eat them. Now, eventually, people realized, hey, these aren't poisonous. And eventually in Europe, folks started eating them. But this is where it gets nuts. They actually did poison themselves with tomatoes, but not in the way they thought. Now, the leaves and the stems of a tomato plant are poisonous. You shouldn't eat them. But the fruit is not. The fruit of a tomato, however, is very acidic. It has that like compound in it that makes your tongue feel a certain way, kind of like lemons and limes do. It's an acidic fruit. And way, way back in the day, the plates that wealthy people in England and other European countries near there would eat off of were frequently made of pewter, which has lead in it. Now, not lead like in the end of your pencil, which is not actually lead, that's graphite, but lead like the element on the periodic table that is poisonous. So they had these plates that were made out of lead, and it was okay because they didn't eat the plates, no big deal. But turns out if you leave something acidic sitting on a plate that has lead in it, like a tomato, for too long, it starts to leach the lead out of the plate. And so people started getting sick from eating tomatoes in England off of plates with lead on them. And so in a way, the tomatoes did end up poisoning them, but it was not the tomatoes' fault. It was the acid's fault. If they'd been eating sliced oranges off the plate, it would have been a problem also. So I particularly love that first people were like, oh no, it's poison. And then they got over it and it actually was poison because of their plates. So this went on for a while. People, deciding that they could eat them and then poisoning themselves and then deciding that they were bad again. But eventually they got popular. People started eating them. They stopped eating them off of lead plates, so they stopped dying. And they are now the popular thing that they are today. Somewhere along the line, people started breeding the tomatoes, so they weren't just those little currant tomato things that started out in South America and Mexico. And that, if you're interested, is something you should go watch the selective breeding history lesson about. History, science, kind of both, because we'll talk about that a lot more. But for now, just know that by choosing the tomatoes that they liked the best and planting those seeds, people made tomatoes different. They made the big, huge, giant ones called beefsteak tomatoes that are really good for putting on like sandwiches or making fried green tomatoes. They made the Romas, the ones that are kind of like an ellipsoid sort of shape that people use a lot in salsa. They made the little tiny grape tomatoes and the cherry tomatoes and the weird little pear-shaped ones that are yellow whose name I don't know. They made all of those tomatoes by using artificial selection, and everything was going great. Until at some point in the last, few hundred years, scientists realized that they'd made a mistake. Because only a few tomato plants came to Europe with the whole Columbian exchange thing, all of the new types of tomatoes that were created had been created from this small group. They didn't have enough genetic diversity. So in a way, it was kind of like all the tomatoes were inbred. We talk about that with animals sometimes, like why animals shouldn't, mate with their siblings and have babies because they'll be all messed up. The same thing happens with plants, except it's not so big of a deal for a plant. It will keep making tomatoes. But having a lack of genetic diversity, having all the tomatoes be too closely related to each other, means that if a disease comes through, it can wipe out all of those tomatoes. A certain bug, maybe, could totally destroy all of the tomatoes because if they're too closely related and one of them is weak against the bug or against the disease, then they all would be. And so what scientists did when they realized this is they went back and they got that little currant tomato, that original one that was still growing wild in some places, and they bred it back with the tomato we have now. So they did some mixing where they took the pollen from one and put it with the flower from the other and brought some of that genetic diversity, some of that other information, some of that resistance to disease back into the tomato population. So the tomatoes we have today have taken a huge trip to make it to where we are now. They started in South America and Mexico, and Columbus and his buddies took them across the ocean to Europe. When they got to Europe, they bounced all over the European countries. They were in Spain, and then they were in Italy, and then they were in Europe, in the upper parts of Europe, like where England is. They've been all over the place, and they spread from there. And at some point, all these tomatoes ended, well, not literally all the tomatoes, but the concept of tomatoes ended up back in a science lab to fix an error that people made way, way back before they knew as much about how to do selective breeding well. And from that, we now have the tomatoes we eat today. We have all of the varieties. Maybe if you're growing a garden this year, you're thinking about what varieties you want to plant. Maybe you want to see if you can find a seed catalog online and look at all the different choices of tomatoes. Maybe you could make a list. I wonder if there are more than 50 different kinds of tomatoes. You could make like a chart of tomatoes where you draw the shapes and try and get the shading right, because there are tomatoes that are not just red. There are many colors of tomatoes. I think anything like that would be really cool follow-up, and I would love to see it if you make a neat project. Have a good day. That has been the history of tomatoes. Go eat some tomatoes if you have some, but you don't have to. Bye. Miss you all.